April 7, 1942. The sky above Port Moresby burns white-hot, a furnace of tropical sun and monsoon clouds building on the horizon. Below, the Owen Stanley Range rises like the spine of a sleeping dragon, emerald green and impossibly vast. Captain Jack Devlin wipes the sweat from his goggles with a trembling finger. His hands, calloused from 1,000 hours in the cockpit, rest on the stick of his Curtiss P-40E Warhawk. He is alone. 4 minutes ago, his wingman spiraled down in flames. Now, Devlin's radio crackles with the gloating laughter of Japanese pilots. They've spotted him. They think he's already dead. This is the moment the empire of Japan's air superiority seemed absolute. This is the moment they mocked the P-40 as a lumbering beast, a relic of old wars. This is the moment they learned that 4 50-caliber machine guns, properly harmonized and aimed, could turn their vaunted Zeros into confetti. By the spring of 1942, the rising sun blazed across the Pacific. Pearl Harbor lay in smoking ruins. Wake Island had fallen. Singapore surrendered. The Philippines crumbled as Douglas MacArthur fled Corregidor, vowing to return. In every direction, the Japanese Zero Mitsubishi's A6M had carved the skies like a scythe. It could outturn, outclimb, and outrun almost anything the Allies could hurl into the blue void. Its range was mythic. Its agility, legendary. Japanese pilots, many with hundreds of hours of combat over China, moved with the arrogant grace of masters who had never known defeat. Allied pilots heard the stories, how Zero pilots would fly upside down, waving at their doomed enemies, how they'd radio insults in broken English, how they could hang on their propellers, seemingly defying physics itself, spitting 20mm cannon shells that disintegrated anything they touched. The Zero wasn't merely an aircraft, it was a psychological weapon. Against this phantom, America offered the P-40 Warhawk, and at first glance the comparison seemed cruel. The P-40 was heavy, it was slow to climb, it couldn't turn with the Zero. Its Allison V1710 engine, a 12-cylinder liquid-cooled power plant generating 1,150 horsepower, choked above 15,000 feet. The plane's stubby nose and angular wings looked brutish next to the Zero's elegant, almost delicate lines. To Japanese pilots, the Warhawk was a joke, a fat American cow waiting for the slaughter. Major Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's greatest aces, wrote in his memoirs that American pilots in P-40 seconds seemed clumsy. "They flew as if they were tied to the ground," he recalled. "We would dance around them, our Zeros light as feathers, our cannons singing." What the Japanese didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that inside the P-40's blunt frame, behind its pilot's armored seat, beneath its self-sealing fuel tanks, waited 4 Browning M2 50-caliber machine guns. Each gun fired 750 rounds per minute. The bullets, half-inch wide and heavy as small hammers, left the muzzle at 2,800 feet per second. And unknown to the Japanese, American armorers had just made a tiny adjustment, a tweak, a shift in convergence pattern that would turn these guns from mere weapons into a guillotine. To understand what happened over Port Moresby that April morning, we must first understand the machines. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was a masterpiece of engineering for a specific philosophy of war. Designer Jiro Horikoshi built it to be light, incredibly light. To achieve this, he sacrificed everything. No armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no bulletproof glass. The Zero's airframe was a delicate lattice of aluminum alloy, covered in a skin so thin you could dent it with a sharp blow. But that lightness gave it performance. With a 900 horsepower Sakai 14-cylinder radial engine, the Zero could climb at 3,000 feet per minute. Its turning radius was a mere 850 feet at combat speed. It could sustain a climb rate that would stall most other fighters, hanging on its propeller in a near-vertical ascent. The Zero's armament was devastating. 2 7.7mm machine guns, synchronized to fire through the propeller, and 2 20mm Type 99 cannons in the wings. The cannons fired shells that weighed nearly 1/3 of a pound. When they hit, they didn't just punch holes. They exploded, they shattered, they dismembered. But the Zero's greatest strength was also its fatal flaw. Its lightness made it fragile. A few well-placed bullets could sever control cables, rupture the unprotected fuel tanks, or snap that delicate airframe like dry kindling. Japanese pilots, trained to believe in their invincibility, often didn't even know this vulnerability existed. They had never faced a weapon that could exploit it. Now, the P-40 Warhawk. Curtiss Aircraft designed the P-40 as an evolution of their older P-36 Hawk. It inherited the Hawk's rugged airframe, a foundation built like a bridge girder. The Allison engine, while modest in high-altitude performance, provided excellent power below 20,000 feet. The Warhawk's top speed was 360 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. Not spectacular. But its diving speed? The P-40 could plunge at over 500 miles per hour without the wings tearing off. The Zero's wings would begin to flutter at 400. The P-40 was a diver. A plummeting falcon. Armor. That's the word that matters. The P-40 pilot sat behind a 3/4-inch thick armor plate. The fuel tanks, 8 in total, were coated with self-sealing rubber. When punctured, the rubber swelled, closed the wound, sealed the leak. The cockpit had bullet-resistant glass. The engine could take hits and keep running. The P-40 was a brawler. It could absorb punishment that would vaporize a Zero. But the key, the absolute heart of the P-40's lethality, was its harmonization. Browning's 50 caliber M2 machine gun was already a legend. Water-cooled versions had stopped German infantry in World War I. The air-cooled M2 variant fired a bullet weighing 709 grains. That's 1.62 ounces of copper-jacketed lead and steel. One round could penetrate an inch of armor plate at 500 yards. Now imagine 4 of these guns, each fed by 235 rounds of ammunition, all firing together. Early P-40 seconds had their guns set to a wide dispersal pattern. The bullets spread like a shotgun blast. This gave a better chance of hitting a maneuvering target, but it also meant that any single hit lacked killing power. You might pepper a Zero with 20 holes and watch it fly on, laughing. Then came the tweak. In March of 1942, at a dusty airfield in Darwin, an armourer named Sergeant Bill MacDonald had an idea. What if they converged all 4 guns to a single point, not a spread but a fist? He adjusted the gun mounts so that at 250 yards, all 4 streams of 50 caliber fire would meet in a space no larger than a dinner plate. At that exact distance, the P-40 wouldn't just hit a Zero, it would obliterate it. MacDonald tested his theory on wreckage of a crashed Zero. At 250 yards, a 1-second burst from the harmonized guns literally cut the Zero's wing spar in half. The armourers had created an aerial sawmill. Back to Captain Devlin, April 7th, Port Moresby. His P-40 shudders at 15,000 feet. The tropical heat makes the engine run rough. Devlin's eyes scan the sky, his throat dry as cotton. He sees them. 4 Zeros. They're above him, circling like kites. Their silver wings flash in the Sunday. He hears their sake engines, a high-pitched whine that sounds like screaming. The lead Zero pilot is Lieutenant Kenji Yanagawa. He has 12 victories. He sees the lone P-40 below and smiles. He waggles his wings, the signal to his wingmen. They will dive, they will strike, they will add another American to their score before lunch. Yanagawa pushes his stick forward. The Zeros come down like falling stars. Yanagawa's 20mm cannons are loaded and ready. At 400 yards, he opens fire. Tracers arc through the sky. The shells explode around Devlin's cockpit. One round punches through the wing, leaving a hole the size of a football. But the self-sealing tank holds. Devlin's armor plate rings like a bell as another cannon shell fragments against it. The P-40 is hurt, but alive. Devlin waits. This is the hardest part. Every instinct screams to turn, to dive, to run. But the Zero turns better. The Zero climbs better. The only thing the P-40 does better is dive faster and shoot straighter. So Devlin waits, counting the seconds, watching the Zeros close the distance. 300 yards, 275. The Zeros are confident now, tightening their formation. their noses filled with Devlin's silhouette. 250 yards. Devlin slams his thumb on the firing button. 4 50-caliber machine guns roar. The sound inside the cockpit is like being inside a thunderclap. The guns fire in perfect synchrony. 1,500 bullets per minute pour from the wings. But these aren't spread across the sky. They're concentrated. Every fifth round is a tracer, and Devlin sees 4 streams of red fire converging on Yanagawa's Zero like the fingers of a closing hand. The first bullets strike the Zero's engine. The Sakai radial, unprotected by armor, disintegrates. Cylons tear free. The propeller shaft snaps. The next bullets, milliseconds behind, hit the cockpit. The glass canopy shatters. Lieutenant Yanagawa's body, unarmored, absorbs the impact. The final bullets, the killing stroke, shear through the wing root. The Zero's left wing folds upward, the aluminum skin peeling away like paper in a hurricane. The aircraft tumbles, end over end, a blossoming flower of fire and smoke. Devlin holds the trigger for 2 seconds. 2 seconds is all it takes. The other 3 Zeros, shocked by the sudden death of their leader, scatter. Devlin picks the nearest one, a wingman, who breaks left. The P-40's Allison engine screams as Devlin pushes the nose down. The Zero tries to turn inside him. It can't. The Warhawk's weight becomes an advantage in the dive. The Zero pulls up, trying to climb away. This is its other fatal flaw. At low speeds, its controls become heavy. The pilot, pulling with all his strength, has made himself a stationary target. 250 yards. Devlin fires again. This time, the bullets hit the Zero's fuel tank. The unprotected tank, filled with high-octane aviation gasoline, explodes. Not a small fire, a detonation. The Zero vanishes in a spherical ball of orange flame. The cockpit is gone before the pilot can scream. 2 down. The remaining 2 Zeros are fleeing now, their confidence shattered. But Devlin's P-40, for all its faults, is faster in level flight at this altitude. He overtakes them. The 3rd Zero tries a snap roll, a desperate evasion. Devlin doesn't follow the maneuver. He knows better. He aims ahead, where the Zero will be, and fires a short, disciplined burst. 3 bullets strike the Zero's tail assembly. Not many, but 3 50-caliber rounds hitting a lightly built control surface is like hitting a kite with a sledgehammer. The entire tail section separates. The Zero flips backward, its nose pointing at the sky, then tumbles into a flat spin. The pilot ejects, his parachute opening against the blue. Devlin doesn't fire at the man in the silk. He has other concerns. The 4th Zero is making for the clouds. Devlin chases. At the edge of a towering cumulus, the Zero tries to hide in the white mass. Devlin banks, following the movement, and sees the glint of silver. He fires blindly, a snapshot. The range is nearly 300 yards, beyond optimal convergence. But the P-40's guns are still harmonized, and a few bullets find their mark. They strike the Zero's wingtip. Not a killing blow, but enough to shatter the aileron. The Zero rolls inverted, its pilot fighting for control. The fragile aircraft, already damaged, starts to come apart in the turbulent air. The wing folds. The Zero falls. 4 Zeros, 1 P-40, 4 minutes. When Devlin lands at 7 Mile Drome, his ground crew counts the bullet holes in his aircraft. 17. 17 holes from 20mm cannon shells, but the armor held. The self-sealing tanks held. The P-40 brought him home, and in his guns, only 40 rounds are left. He fired less than 200 shells to destroy 4 aircraft. Word spreads through the squadron like wildfire. The mocking stops. The laughter from Japanese pilots on the radio? It goes quiet. The story of Captain Devlin's 4 kills in one flight, while extraordinary, was not unique. Similar reports began filtering back from squadrons across the Pacific. The P-40 wasn't just surviving, it was winning, but only when pilots understood the secret. The tweak. Let us examine what Sergeant MacDonald discovered in that Darwin armorer's shack. The concept is called harmonization, and it is both art and science. A machine gun mounted in an aircraft wing does not fire straight ahead. It is aligned to point slightly inward, so its bullets cross the path of the other guns at a predetermined distance. In most fighters of the era, guns were set to converge in a general area, perhaps a cone 30 feet wide at 300 yards. This gave pilots a better chance of hitting something, anything, in the chaos of a dogfight. MacDonald's innovation was radical simplicity. He aligned all 4 P-40 guns to converge at exactly 250 yards, but more importantly, he aligned them to converge at a single point, not a cone. The result was a kill zone, where the bullet density was 4 times higher than normal. In that 250-yard bubble, the P-40's firepower equaled a broadside from a destroyer, but the tweak went deeper. MacDonald also changed the ammunition mix. Standard loads were evenly split, 1 tracer, 1 armor, piercing, 1 incendiary, repeating. But tracers, while helpful for aiming, had different ballistics than solid rounds. They drifted. They inaccurately represented where the other bullets were going. MacDonald reduced tracers to 1 in every 5 rounds. He replaced the missing tracers with armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The new mix, 3 armor-piercing incendiaries, 1 standard armor-piercing, 1 tracer. This gave the P-40 a punch that didn't just hold the zero, it set it ablaze from within. The combined effect was devastating. Japanese aircraft, built with no self-sealing tanks and no armor, relied on not being hit. The P-40 now had a zone where hitting was inevitable, and when it hit, it killed. Pilots had to be retrained. They had to unlearn the instinct to fire at any range. They had to learn patience. Let the zero close. Let them think they had the advantage. At 250 yards, the P-40 pilot would take 1 deep breath, align the nose, squeeze 1 second of trigger, and the sky would become a graveyard. The training took weeks. Instructors painted a 2-foot circle on a target towed behind another aircraft. Don't fire until the zero fills that circle, they taught. Then fire, and only fire a 1-second burst. Ammunition was scarce. Every round had to count. The P-40 could only carry 1,100 rounds total, 235 rounds per gun. At 750 rounds per minute, that's 18 seconds of firing time, total. A P-40 pilot had less than half a minute of ammunition for an entire mission. He could not afford to miss. The best P-40 pilots became disciples of the 1-second burst. They became snipers of the sky. They learned to fly with discipline, resisting the urge to turn with the zero, instead using the P-40's superior dive speed to escape, then climbing back for another pass. They called it boom and zoom. The zero could turn inside a house. The P-40 could dive through the floor. By mid-1942, the P-40 squadrons had become anvils upon which Japanese air power began to break. The numbers tell a story that no single engagement could. The Flying Tigers, operating P-42s over China and Burma before the US officially entered the war, claimed 297 enemy aircraft destroyed. They lost just 12 pilots in combat. That's a ratio of nearly 25 to 1. But the Flying Tigers were mercenaries, volunteers, elite. Their success could be dismissed as exceptional. What couldn't be dismissed was what happened in New Guinea. The 5th Air Force, flying P-40Es and later P-40Ks, fought the Japanese to a standstill over the Owen Stanley Range. Between April and November of 1942, in the brutal air campaign over Port Moresby and Milne Bay, P-40 pilots claimed 412 Japanese aircraft. Japanese records confirm 387 losses. Of those, over 300 were zeros. 300 zeros. In 7 months. In one theatre. The myth of invincibility shattered. In the Solomons, at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, Marine Corps pilot Captain Joe Foss flew P-40 Farad's Wildcats similarly armed and armored, and became the first American ace to match Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 victories. The Japanese called him the Devil. His secret? He never turned with a zero. He dove, fired at 250 yards and climbed away. The statistics became staggering. By the end of the war, The United States Army Air Forces credited the P-40 with destroying 3,136 Japanese aircraft in the Pacific Theater alone. The Navy and Marine Corps, flying carrier-based equivalents with the same armament package, added another 2,000. The number 5,136. But the P-40's story isn't in the aggregate. It's in the specific. It's in the moment a Japanese pilot realized, too late, that the American cow had teeth. Major General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, wrote in his diary, "The P-40 is not the best fighter we have. But it is the best fighter we have here, and in the hands of a pilot who knows its limitations and its strengths, it is the equal of any aircraft in the world." The Japanese began to adapt. They added armor plate to some Zero models. They introduced self-sealing tanks in later variants. But the fundamental flaw remained. The Zero was designed for a war of maneuver, for turning engagements where the better pilot always won. The P-40 changed the rules. It didn't want to maneuver, it wanted to shoot. Once, accurately, fatally, Japanese veteran pilot Tetsuya Iwamoto, who survived the war with 80 confirmed kills, later wrote, "We feared the P-40 not because it was fast, but because it was patient. The American would wait until we committed, until we could not escape. Then the guns would speak, and it was always the same. One burst, one kill. Machines do not fight wars. Men do." And the men who flew the P-40 were forged in a crucible of desperation. Consider the case of Second Lieutenant Robert Hawk Hopkins, 22 years old, fresh from flight school at Luke Field, Arizona. He arrives at Port Moresby in August of 1942, with 40 hours in the P-40. On his first combat mission, his flight is ambushed by 12 Zeros. Hopkins watches his flight leader die in the first pass, a 20mm shell decapitating the man before the aircraft even begins to burn. Hopkins reacts instinctively. He shoves the stick forward, the P-40 diving for the deck, the airspeed indicator quivering past 400 miles per hour. The Zero pursuing him cannot match the dive. Its wings begin to flutter. The pilot pulls up, and Hopkins, at 300 feet above the jungle canopy, levels out and looks back. The Zero is above him, turning for another pass. Hopkins knows he cannot outturn it, but he sees the Zero is coming head-on, arrogantly, certain of victory. Hopkins waits. The Zero grows in his gun sight. 250 yards. He fires. Not a long burst, just a squeeze. 4 guns roar for 1 second. 120 bullets cross the distance. The Zero's engine disappears in a cloud of metal fragments. The propeller stops. The aircraft stalls and falls into the green below. Hopkins lands with 3 bullet holes in his aircraft, and his hands shaking so badly he cannot unfasten his harness. His ground crew chief, a grizzled sergeant named Mike Kolaluka, climbs onto the wing and taps the armor plate behind the cockpit. "See this?" Kolaluka says. "This is why you're alive. And see this?" He points to the gun ports. "This is why he's dead." Hopkins would go on to score 7 more victories before being shot down himself over Rabaul in 1943. He parachuted into the ocean and was rescued by a PT boat. When asked later what saved him, he didn't talk about the P-40's dive speed or its armor. He said, "It was the 250 rule. They taught me. Don't shoot until 250. I only forgot once. That's when I got shot down." The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was profound. Early in the war, they'd transmit in the clear, insulting the Americans. By late 1942, the radio chatter fell silent. They stopped taking unnecessary risks. They began to fear the lone P-40, the aircraft they'd mocked. Because the lone P-40 meant the pilot was experienced, it meant he understood the 250 rule. It meant death waited in a bubble of air exactly 250 yards in front of his nose. This fear changed tactics. Japanese formations grew larger, more cautious. They began using hit-and-run attacks rather than turning dogfights. They started flying higher, trying to force the P-40 into its weak zone above 20,000 feet. But the P-40 pilots refused to play that game. They stayed low, over their own airfields. tempting the Zeros down into the killing zone. The ammunition tweak spread, first to Darwin, then to Port Moresby, to Guadalcanal, to the Aleutians where P-40 seconds fought the same Zero over Attu and Kiska, to China, where Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers had pioneered these tactics before the official change in harmonization. Chennault, in his quiet, methodical way, had his armourers adjust the guns on his P-40 seconds to converge at 250 yards from the very beginning. He knew his volunteer group pilots, outnumbered and outperformed, needed every advantage. He told them, "The Japanese pilot is not your enemy. Gravity is your enemy. Speed is your enemy. Get those right, and the Japanese pilot will die of his own mistakes." Chennault's Flying Tigers proved the concept. In one engagement over Kunming, 4 P-40 seconds engaged 27 Japanese bombers and fighters. The Tigers shot down 14. They lost 1 P-40. The Japanese never understood how 4 outdated American fighters could inflict such carnage. The secret, as always, was the harmonization and the discipline to wait. Victory has a weight. It is measured not just in destroyed aircraft and killed pilots, but in the human beings who must live with the killing. Captain Jack Devlin, our pilot from that April engagement over Port Moresby, survived the war. He finished his tour with 11 confirmed victories. He never spoke of the 4 Zeros he shot down in 4 minutes, not to reporters, not to his family. Only once, in a letter to his brother written in 1944, did he allude to it. He wrote, "I saw their faces, not literally, but I saw them." The first one, the leader. I remember his aircraft had a red band on the fuselage. He was good. He hit me 3 times before I fired back. When my bullets hit him, his airplane just came apart. Like a toy. I didn't feel triumph. I felt relief. That's the terrible secret, Tom. You don't feel like a hero. You feel like a man who has just killed 4 other men and is profoundly grateful to still be breathing. The guns did their job. I just pointed them. The pointing, though, that's what you live with. Devlin's letter captures the moral complexity of technological warfare. The P-40's 50 caliber guns, the harmonization, the ammunition mix, these were technical solutions to a human problem. The problem of how to kill efficiently enough to survive. But the efficiency doesn't erase the humanity. If anything, it sharpens it. When killing becomes mechanical, deliberate, and mathematically precise, the weight of each life taken becomes more acute, not less. Japanese pilots felt this weight too. Lieutenant Kenji Yanagawa, the first pilot Devlin killed, left behind a wife and a son born 3 months after his death. His widow, Keiko, received his ashes and a commendation from Emperor Hirohito. She never understood the technical details of her husband's death. She only knew that the Americans had developed a gun that could kill with a single breath of fire. The realization that her husband had been, in military parlance, out-technologied offered no comfort. The harmonization of the P-40's guns represents a turning point in aerial warfare. It marked the shift from individual aerial duels, where pilot skill was paramount, to a systematized approach where technology and tactics could overcome individual brilliance. The Japanese ace, no matter how gifted, could not defeat geometry, could not defeat the fact that at 250 yards, the American guns created a wall of metal that their unarmored aircraft could not survive. This shift had strategic consequences. Japan lost its best pilots, the experienced veterans of China and Pearl Harbor, not in grand battles, but in countless small engagements where a P-40 pilot, perhaps less skilled, simply waited and fired. Japan's training pipeline could not replace these men. They produced pilots, but not aces, not veterans. By 1943, the average Japanese pilot went into combat with fewer than 100 flight hours. The average American P-40 pilot had over 300. The Americans got better while the Japanese got younger. The P-40's success forced Japan into a defensive posture. The Zero, once the tip of Japan's spear, became a shield. It protected bombers. It escorted reconnaissance planes. It no longer sought combat for its own sake. The psychological impact of the harmonized 50 caliber guns had created a virtual zone of death around American airfields. Japanese pilots avoided the 250 bubble at all costs. Let us speak now of numbers. Not the dry statistics of war, but the numbers that defined existence. 250 yards. That's 228.6 meters. At that distance, the human eye can still see detail. The red rising sun on a Zero's wing, the glint of goggles, the flash of teeth as a pilot grimaces. It is intimate. It is close enough to see the man you are about to kill. And it is exactly where the P-40's guns met. 1 second, that's the burst length the P-40 pilot was trained to use. In 1 second, 4 harmonized M2 Brownings fired 50 bullets. If 20 of those bullets struck a Zero, the probability of a catastrophic kill exceeded 92%. The mathematics were brutal. The Japanese pilot had less than 1 second to realize his mistake, to break away, to live. Most didn't. 709 grains. That's the weight of a single 50 caliber bullet. A fully loaded P-40 carried 1,100 rounds. Total weight of ammunition, 779,900 grains. That's 1,114 ounces. That's 69.6 pounds of copper, lead, and steel that could be delivered in 18 seconds. After which, the P-40 became a 2.5-ton glider, armed with hope and prayers. 3,136. That's the number of Japanese aircraft the USAAF credits to the P-40 inches, the Pacific. But each of those aircraft represents a pilot, a man with a name, a family, a reason for being in that particular patch of sky at that particular moment. The number is both enormous and inadequate. We do not know how many Japanese pilots died specifically because of the harmonization tweak. Records are incomplete. But we can calculate. If the average P-40 pilot scored 2 victories, some many more, some none, and if the harmonization increased the probability of a kill per engagement by 60%, then we can estimate that at least 1,500 Japanese pilots died because Sergeant MacDonald adjusted some bolts in a Darwin shack. One man, with a wrench. Changing the tide of war. 69.6 pounds of ammunition, 1,500 lives. The mathematics of industrial warfare are sobering. The P-40 Warhawk served throughout the war, though by 1944 it had been largely replaced by the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-51 Mustang. It fought in every theatre, North Africa, where it duelled German Messerschmitts over the Sahara, the Aleutians, where it flew in weather that would freeze hydraulic fluid, China, where it became a symbol of resistance, Italy, where it escorted bombers to Rome. But it was in the Pacific, against the Zero, that the P-40 defined its legacy. That legacy is complicated. The P-40 was never the best fighter of the war. It was not the fastest, nor the most maneuverable, nor the most technologically advanced. It was, in many ways, a stopgap, a reliable, rugged, available aircraft that could be produced quickly and flown by relatively inexperienced pilots. It was the right weapon at the right time. But within its steel frame and fabric-covered control surfaces lies a deeper truth about American warfare. The ability to adapt, to take a mediocre tool and, through technical innovation and tactical evolution, make it superior for a specific task. The harmonization of the P-40's guns is a microcosm of the entire American war effort. It reflects an industrial system that could produce spare parts, armorers, and technical manuals that allowed a sergeant in Darwin to change the nature of aerial combat. The Japanese, by contrast, could not adapt quickly. Their Zero remained largely unchanged through 1943, despite mounting losses. Their pilots continued to fly the same tactics, believing in their individual superiority. Their armorers never developed a comparable technical response. They had no tweak that could salvage the situation. By the time they introduced the armoured 052 variant, it was too late. The experienced pilots who could have exploited its improvements were already dead, shot down by P-40 seconds that had turned their initial advantage against them. The P-40's 50 caliber guns also established a standard. The P-47 would carry 8. The P-51 would mount 6. The B-29 bomber would have remotely controlled turrets mounting twin Brownings. The M2 50 caliber became the signature American aerial weapon of the war, a gun so reliable that versions are still in use today, 80 years later. It is a weapon designed by John Browning in 1918, perfected in the 1930s, and harmonized in a Darwin shack in 1942. The P-40's greatest victory was psychological. It restored confidence to American pilots who had been told they were flying inferior machines. It proved that technology, properly applied, could overcome numerical and performance disadvantages. It gave a green second lieutenant with 300 flight hours a fighting chance against a Japanese ace with 1,000 hours. It democratized aerial combat, and in doing so, it changed the course of the Pacific War. We return to April 7th, 1942, to Captain Jack Devlin, climbing out of his battered P-40 at 7 Mile Drome. The sun is setting over the Owen Stanley Range, painting the clouds blood, red and gold. Devlin leans against the fuselage, his legs suddenly weak. He lights a cigarette with trembling hands. His ground crew chief, Mike Kolaluka, hands him a canteen of warm water. "How'd she fly, sir?" Kolaluka asks. Devlin looks at the holes in his wings, at the shattered cockpit glass, at the bullet scars on the armor plate behind his seat. "She flew just fine, Mike. The guns flew better." That evening, in the squadron's debriefing, Devlin tries to explain what happened. He sketches the engagement on a chalkboard. The dive, the convergence, the 250 rule. The other pilots listen in silence. Some have tried to fight the Zero on its own terms. Some have died. Devlin's experience, backed by the mathematics of Sergeant MacDonald's harmonization, offers them a new way, a way to live, a way to win. The next morning, every armourer's crew in the squadron is working on the gun mounts. Wrenches turn, sights are adjusted. Convergence is set to 250 yards. Ammunition belts are loaded with the new mix, 3 API, 1 AP, 1 tracer. The P-40 seconds, battered and patched and leaking oil, become something new. Not better aircraft, but better weapons. The Japanese pilots, listening on their radios that evening, hear no chatter, no American voices. They assume the Americans are frightened. In reality, the Americans are simply done talking. They have said everything they needed to say in 4 bursts of 50 caliber fire that lasted less than 5 seconds total. The war goes on. For 3 more brutal years, the P-40 serves. It is replaced, upgraded, forgotten by history in favor of the Mustang and the Thunderbolt. But in the Pacific, in the critical year of 1942, it holds the line. It teaches the Japanese that American technology, when married to American adaptability, creates something unpredictable, something deadly. The Zero was a sword, beautiful, sharp, perfectly balanced. The P-40 was a hammer, heavy, blunt, unlovely. But Sergeant MacDonald taught that hammer to strike with the precision of a scalpel. And in that teaching, he changed everything. Today, if you visit the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, you can see a P-40E Warhawk. It sits in a hangar, restored to its 1942 configuration. The 4 gun ports in its wings are black circles, faintly ominous. A plaque explains its service history. North Africa, Sicily, Italy. It does not mention Darwin, it does not mention Sergeant MacDonald's wrench, but if you look closely, if you know what to look for, you can see the slight inward angle of the gun barrels. The precise alignment that speaks of a technician's careful hand. You can imagine the math. 250 yards, 1 second bursts, 709 grains of metal crossing the sky at 2,800 feet per second. In Japan, at the Yushukan Museum in Tokyo, a restored Zero hangs from the ceiling, its silver skin gleaming, its red rising sun bright as blood. The plaque describes its agility, its range, its role in establishing Japanese air power. It does not mention its fragility. It does not mention the American guns that turned it into a flying coffin. History remembers the Zero as a symbol of Japanese technological achievement. It remembers the Mustang as the savior of Europe. It has largely forgotten the P-40, but history is written by survivors, and the P-40 ensured that the survivors would be American. The story of the P-40 versus the Zero is not ultimately about aircraft. It is about humility. The humility to recognize that your equipment is not the best, and to find a way to make it better anyway. It is about the humility of the Japanese, who were taught that technological arrogance is a fatal disease. And it is about the humility of the pilots, American and Japanese, who learned that in modern war, technology can erase 50 hours of flight training or 500 with the twitch of a finger. When we speak of war, we often speak of courage, of sacrifice, of strategy. We rarely speak of the armorer with a wrench, of the convergence point of bullets, of the mathematical probability of a 1-second burst causing catastrophic failure, but perhaps we should. Because in the end, it was these small things, the tweak of a gun mount, the mix of ammunition, the discipline to wait until 250 yards that determined who lived and who died. The P-40 Warhawk was not a beautiful aircraft, it was not a perfect aircraft, but it was, for a critical moment, the right aircraft. And its 450 caliber machine guns, harmonized by a sergeant's intuition, shredded more than 3,000 zeros. They shredded an empire's confidence. They shredded the myth of invincibility. They proved that in war, as in life, the simplest adjustment properly applied can change everything. The ghosts of 250 yards still haunt the Pacific sky. They are the ghosts of pilots who learned in their final second that mockery is a luxury only the living can afford. They are the ghosts of a generation who discovered that technology, married to discipline, creates a kind of lethal poetry. A poetry written in tracer fire, converging. The P-40 Warhawk, the hammer that learned to be a scalpel, the aircraft that taught Japan to fear the sound of American guns. And the sound? It is the sound of 4 machine guns firing as one. It is the sound of every 5th round burning red across the sky. It is the sound of 250 yards becoming a boundary between life and death. It is the sound of legend.